Now, last week, if you remember, I suppose even the beginning of last week, announcing sort of the advent of the Reagan era, we were looking at the world circa 1980. There's actually the title of the book by the official historian of MI6 in Britain, that is the spy agency. His name is Christopher Andrew. And he's got a couple volumes out. He's co-authored them with various Russians who had access to the KGB archives. And the title of the volume about the period of like the 60s and 70s is, from the Soviet side, Things Were Going Our Way. That is, they literally were. Countries are going communist. The Brezhnev doctrine is operable. These countries are not joining the West. Remember the fall of the dollar from $35 an ounce when Nixon killed Bretton Woods in 1971 to almost $900 an ounce in January 1980. This notion of American impotence, given credence not just by the humiliating withdrawal from Vietnam and Indochina, but if you remember even slightly afterwards, there was this incident with the American fishing trawler captured by the Cambodians. The Americans mounted a rescue operation, which didn't go well. They couldn't even recapture their own soldiers from Cambodians. Anyway, the Americans look to be a done deal. The army has been infected with not just kind of morale problems. They can't get enlistees with the draft. Not the draft. They can't get volunteers. Half the army is on heroin or marijuana. Things are not going well. I mean, the 70s, sure, they were a fun decade for a lot of people because of the inflation. It was kind of this amoral party decade. We talked about the village people and everything they represented, whereas the Soviet Union was marching from triumph to triumph in the Third World, particularly in Africa. Then there was this kind of like tense confrontation in 1980 with the Moscow Olympics boycotted by the Americans. And it was interesting because the Russians retaliated by boycotting the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984. Only they actually got every single one of the communist bloc countries not to participate. Whereas the Americans asked their allies not to participate, and most of them told the Americans, who cares? And they participated anyway. But of course the Americans remember the 1984 Olympics as the greatest ever because we won all the medals, because there was no competition from the Soviet bloc. So it was very tense. It was a tense time. You remember I talked about all the protests in 1983, which were almost all anti-American in nature, particularly anti-Reagan, because of the impending arms buildup, but expressly about a particular issue, which was related to the Soviet stationing of the SS-20s, targeting Western European capitals like Bonn, Paris, London, etc. It was, of course, the stationing of missiles to counter them, the famous Pershing missiles, although there were also some Tomahawks. The Pershings were the important ones. These, by the way, in terms of category, are what are called intermediate range. That is not the ICBM intercontinental, the ones sent like back and forth from Russia to America, but rather the ones of medium range, kind of like the ones stationed in Turkey, which could, let's say, go from a point in Eastern Europe and reach Paris. This was the category known as intermediate range. Naturally, if you remember, Reagan, by stationing these missiles in Europe at the insistence of the European governments who basically begged him to defend them from the Soviets, naturally all the protesters in Europe protested Reagan, the man trying to defend them, and not the Soviet Union trying to kill them. But I guess that's the way protests work. 2 million people in the streets, supposedly. That was the number I heard. But so anyway, so things were tense, things were going the Soviets' way, but a few glimmers of life were beginning to appear inside the Western Alliance. I mean, the way the story is usually told today, in a way there are kind of like three main protagonists. You might call this a triumphalist narrative. However, it does have a ring of triumphalism about it, but it also has a ring of truth because a lot of it was actually true. Because most of the West in the 1970s was in favor of conciliation of the Soviet Union. You remember détente, that being the American version of the policy. The Carter version, I just call it kind of roll over and play dead. We're not even going to pretend like we're trying to counter the Soviets. We're just going to kind of do what they say, and we're going to reduce our own arms stockpile without asking them for anything in return. That was the Carter policy. The European version, epitomized particularly by Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik, it was mostly economic. It was about coexistence and trade. Let's send them loans. Maybe they'll buy our goods. let's try to alleviate their position by, again, giving loans and money to the government. You might remember I mentioned the American version of this with Ceausescu in Romania, and who operated the most tyrannical crackpot dictatorship in all of Eastern Europe, but weirdly enjoyed most favored nation status with Washington in terms of trade policy. And the reason, of course, was that he had friendly relations with West Germany and Israel, which was very unusual in the Eastern Bloc. The reason he did, you might remember, was because there were a lot of Germans living in Romania. The famous Pied Piper legend, it's all about the Saxons who traveled down the Siebenbergen. There are 7 towns in Romania, like the Bukovina, Kronstadt being the most famous of them. They used to be German, but no Germans left, because Ceausescu sold them all. He sold them all. He sold exit visas, about $5,000 a pop. And he did the same, of course, with Jews, basically selling Jews to Israel. That is to say, he sold exit visas. So he's running these rackets, and weirdly, he gets all these diplomatic privileges from the West. There was then the whole principle, again, I talked about the other day, of lack of reciprocity. You know, the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Dubrynin, has as much access as he wants to the White House whenever he wants it. The American ambassador has to go through like 6 or 7 layers of bureaucracy before he can get anyone remotely connected to the Politburo on the phone. All of this stuff was, though, beginning to change. The 3 protagonists, again, that I mentioned. One I already mentioned, of course, was John Paul II. Now, his role, it was more symbolic than anything else. But the solidarity thing was important. As we talked about in the first half of the lecture, it was a show of strength, protesters, peaceful protests against the Soviet Union, which did not, in the end, topple the regime. But they made clear that the regime enjoyed no popular support. In other words, in a way, they punctured the myth of these countries in Eastern Europe. They showed the world, you might say, that these regimes existed only because they were propped up by the Soviet Union. Threat of force. They had no popular support. So even though it did not succeed in the short run, in the long run, solidarity undermined the legitimacy of these governments in Eastern Europe, which frankly never should have been in question. I talked about the East German case. You know, East Germany, because of its strategic location, Berlin, etc., was always a high Soviet priority. They had 1 million soldiers just in East Germany. It was a garrison state. It was simply an occupied country. It wasn't a real country. True, they had an Olympic team, and all those butch East German women won all the medals because they were doping earlier and better than everybody else. It's amazing, in all these sports, they still have these records going back to like 1983, you know, back before they figured out doping. And that's because the Eastern Bloc just doped everybody to the gills. So it wasn't a real country. I mean, yeah, they had Olympic teams, but it was a Soviet garrison state. Poland, yeah, it was more of a country, but for that very reason, communism was much less legitimate, and everyone now knew it. So the Pope, again, is more of a kind of moral symbolic authority. It was interesting, though, that he shared a certain kind of almost personal solidarity with Reagan for the interesting, okay, it's partly because Reagan was Irish, you know, meaning even that he wasn't really a practicing Catholic, but like in some nominal sense, his ancestors were Catholic. That was less important than the fact that the two of them were both shot within a couple of weeks of each other. You remember I talked about the other day, John Hinckley in love with Jodie Foster. I don't know why assassins do this. They think like the woman is going to drop at their feet after they murder the president. Anyway, so he shoots Reagan to win the love of Jodie Foster. That was in, I guess, March of 1981. Then 2 months later, of course, the famous Turkish assassin, although working for the Bulgarian Secret Service, you know the story, right? Mehmet Ali Akça tried to assassinate the Pope, who later on forgave him, interestingly. He actually like took communion or something. But anyway, so that happened in May. So it was like within a couple, like 6 weeks of each other. And it was while this solidarity thing was going on. You know, so the 2 failed assassination attempts, they had a kind of political significance. Not just in the way they enhanced Reagan and his persona and his reputation, in part because he handled it with such aplomb, you know, kind of joking, you remember with the surgeons, you know, I sure hope you're all Republicans. And, you know, he was very cheerful afterwards, and like he gave a speech a little while after they attempted to shoot him, and just at the end of the speech, you know, he said something like, well, thank you all very much for your applause. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to go out the back door. You know, so he wouldn't get shot again. Well, anyway, you know, it was partly just the political thing of surviving the assassination, which obviously makes him seem kind of potent. Now, with the Pope, I suppose it was even more powerful than that, because, of course, he's supposed to be, you know, essentially a holy man, kind of God's, you know, not divine, but I mean his regent on earth, who is, of course, the physical representative, the embodiment of the Catholic Church, and he survives the assassination attempt. So it not only, I think, lent him political authority and prestige, it also helped lead to this humongous revival of Catholicism. Not so much in Europe. Well, in Eastern Europe, yes, but much more in what we used to call the Third World, particularly Africa and Asia, where to this day, in fact, Christianity is the world's fastest growing religion. A lot of people think it's Islam. That's not actually true. In Europe, it's true. Islam is kind of on the march and Christianity is waning. But Christianity is making huge inroads in Africa and Asia. So the Pope and his whole era, in some ways, kicked this off. And some of it was the fact that he was kind of the first non-Italian pope in a long time, so it made it seem like the church was being more open to other nationalities and groups. Part of it was his own kind of charisma, the fact that he survived the assassination attempt, that he stood up to communism, he declared solidarity with, well, solidarity. He declared his own solidarity with the Solidarity movement. He was not afraid to denounce communism and its evils. It's true that, he was also no great friend of capitalism in the sense that, as essentially a religious figure, he wanted people to focus not on material things. He didn't like the idea of people focusing too much on either the one or the other. But mostly, of course, his moral authority and prestige was given to the kind of anti-communist crusaders, particularly in Eastern Europe. There was also, there was an element of kind of showmanship too, in that he traveled more than any pope had before. Using, of course, the jet airplane to the fullest, traveling the world so people could see him. He even had a special car built. They called it the Pope Mobile. It was kind of bulletproof, but with glass, so you could see him and everything. So, anyway, he played a huge role in not only, I think, leading to this revival of Catholicism, but also giving hope to a lot of people in Eastern Europe, particularly Catholics, particularly in Poland. And the fact that he and Reagan developed a close personal friendship actually, I think, had a lot to do with, again, the revival of, shall we say, morale, you might say, on the Western side of the Cold War. Now, Margaret Thatcher is kind of the third here. The Iron Lady, as the Russians called him. Actually, that's what they called her, but she liked it so much she started calling herself that. She is still, of course, a controversial figure inside Britain. I suppose outside Britain she is more, I wouldn't say revered is the right word, but she's definitely respected, for her strength. In part because her policies were controversial. Domestically, she took on the unions, which had, to a certain extent, by the 1970s, taken over Britain. The government was now running things like the health service, telecoms, the airlines. Efficiency was down. A lot of strikes happened in the late 1970s. Right before she came to power, there was the so-called winter of discontent, where there wasn't enough coal, the trains weren't running, even the newspapers weren't showing up because, the printer unions were striking. In some ways, some of this went back to the days right after the Second World War. In the first influx after labor first came to power, they put through all of these privileges, making the position of labor virtually unassailable. Things having to do with the secret ballot, things having to do with strikes, which would be called, whether or not all of the workers necessarily supported them. A lot of them were kind of arcane legal issues, but basically everything had gone over to the side of labor. And a lot of people thought it had gone too far, that Britain had become ungovernable. There were strikes all of the time. The country was just turning into sort of like a has-been. Famously in 1976, Britain had to be bailed out by the IMF because of its poor government finances. This is Britain, the country that sort of invented capitalism in the Industrial Revolution. Okay, with Dutch input, yes. But so Thatcher, yeah, to some extent, her policies, controversial at the time, were eventually absorbed even by labor. So that Tony Blair, when he came to power in 1997, you might even say indirectly, in fact, he even did talk about Thatcher. He more or less kind of we're all capitalists now sort of thing. That even labor agreed that the private sector was more efficient than the public sector, even if they disagreed as to how much you should spend on things like welfare. Anyway, all of that was domestic. In some ways, more important was Thatcher's role in foreign policy. Particularly one conflict, the Falklands War of 1982. Small conflict, not a kind of globe-shattering thing, but significant in terms of Western morale. it wasn't really about communism. I mean, there was a military junta in Argentina. They occupied the Crown Colony, the Falkland Islands, still supposedly part of the British Commonwealth. They didn't think Britain would react because, again, Britain was seen as just kind of a has-been by this point. British power was not respected. Decolonization had, you might say, deprived the British Empire and the British nation of its kind of raison d'etre. There was this whole phenomenon of, kind of feeling guilty about the empire and not feeling like it was something to be celebrated and so on. Well, Thatcher almost single-handedly decided to reverse the thing. She set the clock ticking. Basically, she set the Navy on its way and gave them an ultimatum. Pretty much by the time our Navy arrives, if you haven't scurried back to Argentina, we will crush you. And then she crushed them. Yes, it was a small little war. Casualties were light, in a few hundreds. It wasn't a big conflict, but it had a lot to do with restoring, I think, British prestige in the world, and particularly the morale of the British armed forces. It also, one might say, paved the way for a similar operation staged by the Americans the following year in Grenada. This was politically more significant, and that is because Grenada was the first literal reversal of the Brezhnev doctrine. The first time a country which had gone communist was, shall we say, recaptured by the other side, by the American side in the Cold War. Grenada had gone communist really, I think it was 1979, although the dictator who had taken power was not particularly extreme or ambitious. In fact, oddly, it was the overthrow of the communist dictator which eventually led to the American intervention, because the military kind of junta that threw him over had more ambitions. They were more serious communists. They started building, all of these like runways, which they were going to use to bring in planes from Cuba and the Soviet Union. They already had Cuban auxiliaries on the ground. It basically looked like it was going to be another Cuba. That is another one of these kind of little islands in the Caribbean, which would serve as a base for the projection of Soviet power. Probably indirectly through Cuba, but nonetheless a strategic base for the communists. Now, we know this because, in fact, Reagan did not just act unilaterally. He was actually asked to invade by most of the local leaders of the other islands in the Caribbean who were terrified. They did it secretly, of course, and quietly, because they didn't want to sound like American stooges. But Reagan, I think in part encouraged by Thatcher's success, decided that the time had come to test the fiber of the American volunteer military. So he sent the troops in over great political opposition. In fact, the leadership of Congress even told Reagan, because he informed them at the last minute. He hadn't given them notice of what was going to happen, because it all happened very quickly. And so they told him, look, if it goes well, we'll back you. If it doesn't, you're on your own. It went well. The Americans did lose troops. They lost about 120 troops, so it was not bloodless. They overthrew the junta, the new communist dictatorship. They expelled all the Cuban auxiliaries. And they famously, rescued a bunch of Americans who were there, many of them actually attending medical school, of all things. The symbolism of it, though, is significant because even Reagan's advisors told him, look, this is risky. Because it happened in October of 1983. It's this tense year with all these protests in Europe about the Pershing missiles. The year he made his kind of notorious, evil empire speech about the Soviet Union. He gets a lot of flack for that. It's also the year he launched the Strategic Defense Initiative. I'll talk about that in a moment. So there's a lot of controversy swirling around. Even though the operation was a success, even Reagan's own advisors thought, remember his poll numbers are low. The economy is just recovering from recession. They thought it was going to be a bad thing, that there was going to be huge hell to pay in American politics because they had lost 120 troops. Then what happened? The medical students that had been rescued, the Americans, they came in on these military planes. They landed in Washington. The TV cameras were rolling. And the first of them got off the plane, and he bent down, and he kissed the ground. Happy to be back on American soil. You might say it was an accident, but politically, symbolically, it seemed to say, well, the operation was a success. You remember, America had not fully recovered from the trauma of Vietnam. America didn't have its confidence in its military. The military didn't have prestige. Grenada was the first step towards rebuilding that prestige. The brand of the military, the confidence in the military, simply the idea that the Americans could do anything right, which had come to seem, I think, doubtful. So Grenada mattered. The Falklands mattered. What mattered a lot more, though, is SDI, which sounds a little weird because these were actual real wars involving real soldiers and real battles and real casualties. SDI never actually came into existence. But politically and strategically, it was more important. Okay, so what was SDI? Have you heard of the term? Have you heard of this term, MAD? MAD. Do you know what it stands for? Anyone? MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. The strategic doctrine of the latter half of the Cold War. You remember the early half of the Cold War, it went like this. The Americans had nuclear superiority. The Soviets had 3 million troops in Europe, and they kind of canceled each other out. The idea is the Soviets wouldn't use those troops, because if they did, the Americans would launch their devastating nuclear arsenal, etc., etc. Well, if you remember, right around 1971, the Soviets had not just equalized American strategic strength in terms of the nuclear arsenal. They had surpassed it. By the early 1980s, the Soviets had outright superiority across the board in ICBMs, intermediate range, and short range nuclear missiles. So that old strategic doctrine was invalid. The Soviets, in a sense, could have invaded Western Europe and might have even considered doing so at the height of the tensions in 1983, except that, again, they're now running out of money and they have too much problems on their hands as it is. The new doctrine was mutually assured destruction, which basically meant this. Even though the Soviets have more missiles than the Americans, they both have so many that they could wipe out every last man, woman, and child in both countries. And so therefore, neither would attack, because doing so would invite retaliation, which would mean everyone would be dead. So that was the doctrine. They won't fight each other, because if they do, everyone will be dead. Mutually assured destruction. It has a kind of ring to it, doesn't it? MAD. M-A-D. Mutually assured destruction. It isn't, however, the most attractive doctrine, you might say, politically or even in human terms. Reagan didn't like it. It's curious, because people thought Reagan was a warmonger. That's what they said. The man wants war. That's why he wants to build up American armed strength and so on. That's not the way Reagan saw it. Reagan thought MAD was, well, mad. He thought it was insane. He went to visit NORAD in 1979. There's an interesting story about this. NORAD, incidentally, stands for, I guess, what, the Northern something, I don't even remember what it stands for. It's famous mostly from the movie War Games. The place actually exists. It's one of those like bases they have inside the mountains where, like, you know, in case of nuclear war, you go way down underneath the mountain and that's where the command and control center is. I guess you guys wouldn't have seen that, but you might have seen like Terminator 3. Like we're right at the end of the movie, you know, they've got that mountain like down underneath the mountain. NORAD is like a real life version of that. It's actually the North American Strategic Command inside this humongous mountain in Colorado. Well, anyway, so Reagan went and visited this place in 1979. He wasn't president yet. He was just curious. And he asked these people, well, so what do? You know, if the Soviets launch their missiles? And the guy said, well, I guess we launch our missiles. And Reagan said, well, what? So you mean so we're all dead and then they're all dead? And the guy said, yeah, pretty much. So Reagan said, what? You mean there's no way of actually stopping the missiles? And the guy said, well, no, there isn't. And Reagan thought, well, that's nuts. That is mad. And so he came up with the idea that the Americans might actually try to defend themselves, the Strategic Defense Initiative. The critics dubbed it Star Wars, and they weren't wrong. I mean, the thing was unrealistic, and as it turned out, the Americans never did quite master the anti-ballistic missile technology. I mean, even today, you know, they're doing these tests, and you know, you can just barely knock a few missiles out of the sky if you're on a good day. You certainly couldn't knock like 400 incoming thermonuclear missiles out of the sky. You couldn't. I mean, maybe you can 20 years from now, but you still can't today. But here's the thing. You remember that there's not only the fog of war that Clausewitz talked about in the battlefield, but statesmen face this too. No one really knows the future. So simply by talking about this, Reagan actually altered the strategic climate. And here's the reason we know this. Although a lot of people in America thought the idea was pie in the sky, as they called it. They said, like, oh, Reagan got this from one of his movies or something, because he was an actor. They didn't take it seriously. They didn't think it was realistic. The Soviets did take it seriously. We know this because a lot of them later said this, and they admitted it. They were terrified by it, and they complained about it. They said the Americans were trying to basically invalidate our entire nuclear arsenal, that is, make it irrelevant by knocking the missiles out of the sky. Now, of course, no one really knew whether the Americans would be able to do this. Everyone knew it would take experimentation, money, etc. But here's the thing. The American economy had begun to recover. The dollar was strong. Oil was low. Gold was cheap again. The American economy was on the march. People remembered that in the 1960s, the Americans had put a man on the moon at, frankly, insane cost. Maybe they could do this too. The Soviets didn't know for sure. We know they took this seriously. And we know it not least because we have the transcripts. I'll give you an example. Gorbachev, at the first major summit with Reagan at Geneva in 1985, he said, and I quote, it went something like this: "We will smash your shield." He actually lost his temper. He did not want the Americans to go through with SDI. In policy terms, what this meant was this. They had a couple of summits to talk about reducing nuclear stockpiles. They didn't agree on anything. The reason they didn't was because Gorbachev insisted that the Americans abandon the Strategic Defense Initiative. That is, if they not try to build anti-missile devices, because it would invalidate MAD and reduce the Soviet arsenal to nothing. Reagan was actually very clever about the way he played this. When people said, well, you're trying to alter the strategic balance and this is going to lead to nuclear war, you know what he said was, well, all I'm trying to do is reduce our vulnerability to nuclear weapons. If we build this and it works, we'll share it with the Russians. He actually said that. He said the Americans would share the technology with the Russians. His idea was to invalidate this ugly doctrine of MAD one way or the other. And what could the Russians say to that? Of course, they didn't believe him. They thought he was BSing. What they did instead was they gritted their teeth and got really, really angry. And Reagan gave them nothing. He, of course, got criticized for it. At both of these arms reduction summits, they have all the photo ops, the fireplace, the handshakes. They agreed on nothing. And, of course, everyone gave Reagan flack for this. You're not reducing your arms stockpiles like you said we were supposed to. And Reagan said, well, they're asking me to abandon SDI, and I can't do that. There are a couple things working in Reagan's favor. One of which, if you remember, was the oil prices dropping. He knew that the Soviet economy, despite all of the propaganda, was, you remember from his jokes, he realized it didn't work. So he figured it was going to collapse. So he figured, I'll just wait them out. Because they're desperate. Because they need our money. Because they can't afford an arms race. They can't afford to match SDI. And so he waited. He established 4 basic conditions. He said, I will not agree to any reduction of arms on our side unless you improve your human rights record, that was number 1. You open up Eastern Europe, that was number 2. You withdraw from Afghanistan, that was number 3. And number 4 was, of course, you reduce your own nuclear stockpile. By 1988, the Soviets had agreed to all 4. They had enacted glasnost, as it was called, usually translated as openness. This is actually a mistranslation. What it really meant was a peculiar sort of a Russian tradition where the state-controlled media would be loosened up just a little. The idea being they wanted reporters at least to be able to find out which factories were screwing up and why. They didn't really want people to talk about, like, Gorbachev and the nature of his rule and that sort of thing. They wanted limited discussion of certain issues. But eventually this did lead to discussion of larger issues. Eventually you got people talking about crimes of the Stalin era. You got people talking about the Gulag. You got eventually certain dissidents being released and so on. Now, it wasn't that Reagan himself caused this. In a way, the real cause was Chernobyl, of course, the great nuclear meltdown of 1986. And more than the meltdown itself and its aftermath in terms of radiation, sickness, poisoning, etc., was the fact that television news did not even mention it until basically nearly 3 days after the thing happened. So it massively discredited the state media. You remember they even had kept the weather a state secret. They didn't even report on the weather. So now it had embarrassed the government. So Gorbachev said, look, we need more openness. We need more discussion of corruption, inefficiency, etc. Just to backtrack, I mean, Gorbachev's original idea for jump-starting the economy so he could compete with the Americans was prohibition. That was the main policy, actually, after Gorbachev came to power. They prohibited alcohol in Russia. You can imagine how well that went down. Everyone, of course, just had their own little distillery, bathtub gin, or samagon, as they call it. If anyone has ever tried samagon, and I don't recommend it, it is really horrible. They had 11,000 deaths from alcohol-related poisoning in the first year alone from everyone. They would have sniffing glue and paint thinner and airplane fuel and whatever they could get their hands on. They actually plowed under the vineyards in Georgia. They literally destroyed the vineyards so they couldn't produce wine. They also prosecuted over 600,000 people for illegally producing alcohol. It's an interesting idea. Gorbachev thought, and he wasn't wrong, that productivity was low in part because people were drunk all the time. But of course that was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was, of course, the lack of the market mechanism, the lack of incentive, the lack of profit motive. So he didn't really figure that out. He also didn't realize that alcohol sales were one of the government's primary sources of revenue. And so he bankrupted the government with prohibition too. It was a dumb policy in every possible sense of the word. So things got worse. There are industrial scandals and accidents, stories that begin to percolate around, like Vorkuta, the great mines there. They don't even have soap. These miners, they're working in coal dust all day. They're covered in soot, and they don't even have soap to clean up. Vorkuta, there might be one there, but it's also, I think there probably is. It's also known as one of the great mining regions of the Soviet Union. And whenever there's a crisis, there's always trouble in the mines of Vorkuta. It's almost like a cliche. So economic problems. And this is what leads to the famous policy of quote-unquote perestroika, which if you know your Russian perestroy, it means to kind of rebuild. My own favorite story about this, to have a little bit of fun with Gorbachev, is in the 1990s, after Gorbachev had been disgraced and discredited and had gone to the West to advertise for McDonald's and Pizza Hut, lately he's been hawking for Louis Vuitton luggage, the luxury luggage line. Anyway, so these Americans played a practical joke on him. There's an American football team called the New York Jets, and they hired a new coach this one year. Like the previous year, they were terrible, so they hired a new coach. They're trying to, rebuild the team. And anyway, so they called up Gorbachev's office and they said, hey, we've got this project. We're trying to improve the New York Jets football team. We hear you're going to be visiting America this fall. Would you like a job as the perestroika coordinator of the New York Jets football franchise? And he actually said, yes, I want the job. So they ran this headline with a picture of Gorbachev with a football helmet on. Gorby goes deep for the New York Jets. By that point, it was easy to make fun of him. But that's the thing, his policies just didn't work. There was my favorite joke of the Gorbachev era. It's funny, but it's also dark. It goes like this. So, a farmer has this problem. His chickens are dying, right? Like 20 of them have just keeled over dead. So he goes to Gorbachev. Gorbachev, what can I do? My chickens are dying. Gorbachev tells him, well, give them aspirin. He gives them aspirin. Another 4 chickens die. He goes back to Gorbachev. Gorbachev, they still die. I don't know. What do I do? He says, okay, try castor oil. He goes back. They try castor oil. Another 10 chickens die. Goes back to Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, please help me. I'm desperate, desperate. He says, all right, penicillin. Give them penicillin. He goes back. He gives them penicillin. They all die. They're all dead. No more chickens. Bye-bye. Dead. No more farm. No more chickens. He goes back to Gorbachev. He lays his head. He tells him the news. And Gorbachev says, oh, what a pity. I had so many more remedies to try. Anyway, so that was perestroika in Soviet popular humor. Yes, there were a few so-called economic reforms, to do with setting up collectives where people might have a slightly more incentive to produce. A few ambitious farmers, were given the option of borrowing money to set up private farms. The reason that didn't work was because whenever anyone set up a private farm, it would work really well. They would get rich, everyone would get jealous, and then they'd burn down the farm. So that didn't work either. So those policies aren't working. The Soviet Union is basically going broke, in part because of the collapsing oil price, partly because of its own internal problems. And so the Soviet Union is finally desperate. They finally give in across the board on everything the Americans want. A full-on withdrawal from Afghanistan, front-loaded beginning in 1988. Every single arms reduction the Americans ask for, they grant. They allow the Americans to go ahead with SDI, just as Reagan demands. And then, of course, famously in 1989, as the cascading wave of anti-communist kind of protesters in Europe. By the way, 1989, it's a big year. It's a big year. We'll come back to it, and so you should definitely remember at least some of the basic events. At least remember that the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. I think we can all probably remember that. I got a student's answer on a question once. I asked them what happened in 1989, and the student said, "My parents got divorced." And that might be true. I don't know if it's relevant for this course. You should at least remember that the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The key events which really began, I suppose, spiraling out of control as far as Soviet control of Eastern Europe were these, in kind of order. Hungary opened its border with Austria in May. Remember the basic fact of the Soviet bloc? It was a prison. You couldn't leave. Now you could. Suddenly you could go to Austria, which meant from there you could go to Germany. You could go on anywhere in the West. You could go to America if you wanted to, if you had enough money, if you were willing to apply for the visa. And this basically, it wasn't just Hungary. What it basically meant was now people in the Eastern Bloc able to travel to Hungary could also go to Austria, Germany, etc. So a lot of East Germans, for example, went to West Germany not by crossing the wall, which was still dangerous, but rather by going by way of Hungary, Austria, etc. Now this, it definitely kind of ripped apart the communist passive control in Hungary. It gradually began to loosen control in East Germany and Poland and Czechoslovakia as well. Poland, though, went its own way in June, when, in part inspired by Gorbachev himself, who had called for elections in the Soviet Union to the Congress of People's Deputies. Yes, again, it was only communists who were supposed to run, but it was still elections of a kind. The Poles had their own elections in June. And to the surprise of people who weren't well informed, to no one's surprise who was well informed, Solidarity won a crushing victory. The communists were just wiped off the slate. No one wanted communism in Poland. So that was significant. It was these events coupled with the rising pressure in East Germany that eventually led to, I think, one of the greatest diplomatic quotes of all time, which you should definitely remember this one. That was, well, actually, there are two of them in succession. I think they're the two greatest of them. Reagan in 1987, actually speaking in Berlin, kind of calling Gorbachev's bluff with glasnost and perestroika. He tells him, look, if you're really trying to liberalize, then I tell you, come here to Germany, Mr. Gorbachev. Come to this gate. Come to this wall. Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev. The Berlin Wall. 2 years later, not just did the Berlin Wall actually get torn down, but the Soviet foreign minister, Gennady Gerasimov, when asked what the Soviet policy was regarding events in Eastern Europe, he said, well, you see, before, we had Brezhnev doctrine, right? Once country communist, it stays communist. Well, today, I don't know, not Brezhnev doctrine. What about, do you know song by Frank Sinatra? My way, my way. These countries are free to go their way, their way. He actually announced the Sinatra doctrine. That's what he called it. The new Soviet policy was countries in Eastern Europe could go their way. Okay, this all sounds wonderful, and it is. It's one of the happier stories in human history, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, without essentially a shot being fired. That's why I have the Sun Tzu quote here. yes, the Soviet Union in that sense collapsed, or at the very least, it didn't collapse till 1991, but it at the very least allowed its empire to go free in 1989, which was, of course, mostly a good thing. In almost every way, it was a good thing. We shouldn't entirely be naive and accept everything at face value, however. A couple of small facts that I'm going to throw out just to kind of keep a monkey in the wrench. One of which is that, of course, the Soviets did extract a price for allowing Germany to be reunified, for allowing all of these countries not to go communist. We're still figuring out exactly what that price was. A lot of it was money. A lot of it was new loans. In fact, some of the Russian loans, if you follow finance, they talk about like the Paris Club and the London Club. A lot of this stuff goes back to the late 1980s. There are also a lot of very serious shenanigans involving the Soviet withdrawal. Remember, they had 3 million troops in Eastern Europe. They occupied a lot of territory, buildings. They ran enterprises. They ran whole industries. A lot of these things were turned over to West European firms and governments that, shall we say, knocked down prices. The corruption scandals are still enveloping European politics. Like Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor at the time, was disgraced like a whole decade later, in part because of scandals going back all the way to 1989. If you want to know a little bit about it, actually, you could Google the famous French oil company called Total Elfina, which had a lot to do with some of these nationalization deals. But meanwhile, there's another aspect to this. Gorbachev, as I have said, is largely still revered in the West as the man who, I guess, ended the Cold War, which is a bit strange because you remember what I started with. It wasn't his intention to end the Cold War. It was not his goal. That was the result of his policies. It's important to keep that gap in mind because although, again, he's revered in the West, he is despised in the Soviet Union. He ran for president in 1996. He got about 800,000 votes. This is the first time he actually decided to run for office. 800,000, it sounds like a lot. If you're running in like a municipal council election, I suppose that would be good. But the Soviet Union was, of course, a country of, well, by that point, Russia was a country of 150 million people, right? So 800,000 is not a lot. It's less than 1% of the electorate. He's not revered in Russia. Russians see him as the man who, of course, destroyed their empire. Not entirely untrue. Wasn't his intention, that was the result. We can talk about it all as, again, the kumbaya, everyone gets out and has a street party in Eastern Europe. My favorite one is the revolution in Prague. They called it the Velvet Revolution, or there's also another kind of a fun term associated with a historian called Timothy Garden Ash. He called it the Magic Lantern. There's a lot of humbug here, of course. Basically what happened is that after the Hungarians and the Poles and the East Germans had already done the work of destroying communism and its legitimacy in Eastern Europe, showing that the Russians wouldn't intervene, then the Czechs decided to have their revolution, once it was no longer dangerous. The Czechs, again, if you listen to the knock on them, like by the Poles, they always surrender. This time they didn't surrender, they had a revolution, but once there was no longer any opposition. Not much opposition, anyway. And, Prague, it's a fun place. And it's true, basically, like a bunch of revolutionaries like Václav Havel, they sat around in pubs, drinking beer and just deciding to overthrow the government. There was a little bit of coercion involved, but not that much. But so the revolutions, again, on the surface, were very happy. The Sinatra doctrine, it sounds great. We still are trying to figure out a lot of what was really going on in the Soviet Union at the time, though. We've seen, for example, at least those who have seen the statistics, mostly Russian journalists who investigated this, that in fact the Soviet Union stepped up its expenditure on arms in the late 1980s. They built more tanks. Until the final arms reduction treaties, they even built more ballistic missiles. They built more guns. They actually had, by 1989, the highest ratio of what is called armor to manpower. That is the amount that's actually spent on things like tanks and planes and submarines as compared to the soldiers in the history of the world. Biological weapons spending program in the Soviet Union actually peaked in 1992, which was a year after the Soviet Union collapsed. We're still piecing together the story. But it seems to be that Gorbachev had very close connections to the KGB, and that when he came to power in 1985, they actually did want to compete with the Americans and build up their arms, and they actually did try to do so. The effort bankrupted them. Soviet gold reserves between 1988 and 1990 dropped to zero. The gold disappeared. This is the kind of stuff you actually read about in like the Russian yellow press, like where did all the gold go, you know, that kind of stuff. In fact, my favorite story about this is that right after the Gulf War in 1991, when they had the first conference, it was actually in Madrid, which would lead to the Oslo Accords between Israel and Palestine. Gorbachev and the Soviet delegation actually left without paying their hotel bill because they were broke in 1991. So, U.S. economic pressure, U.S. strategic and military pressure. I haven't talked much about Afghanistan, but in some ways that was in fact the key element in the breakdown of Soviet power and prestige. And there, of course, is a little bit less savory. I mean, we all know famously about the blowback with the Mujahideen and people like Osama bin Laden, you know, who in some ways was born of this era, the resistance against the Soviets. The Americans did not act directly in Afghanistan. They mostly used, of course, their proxies in Pakistan. The so-called ISI, or Pakistani intelligence, handled many of the actual weapons shipments into Afghanistan. It was the Stinger missile which supposedly did the most damage. I mean, it was quite simple. The Soviets, when they were up in their helicopter gunships, were invulnerable, just shooting everybody from the air. Once they had the Stinger missiles, heat-seeking missiles, they could knock the Soviet helicopters out of the air. That's what turned the tide in the war and eventually, one might say, broke the back of the Soviet military in the Soviet Union. We're still piecing together elements of that story, too. So there's a lot that we still don't entirely know. But the fall of the Soviet Union was, again, partly due to this external pressure, partly due to oil prices and economic pressure, partly due to the war in Afghanistan. I think in the end, though, we could chalk it up to Western resolve and, need I say it, Gorbachev's incompetence. Was not what he meant to do, but it is what he did. Which reminds me of, I think, the best line I've ever heard about communism by a historian called Martin Malia, talking about the various, absurdities of it and so on. He said, he used the word socialism, but meaning what we think of as communism. He said, there is no such thing as socialism, and the Soviet Union built it. So you can meditate about that as we conclude our lecture on the fall of communism. Okay, so we have one more class, proper class, on Friday, and then we will do the review class, if you remember, on, was the 25th, right, which was Wednesday, May 25th at 5 p.m. at my office. And please do come Friday because I'll have your quizzes.